The courtroom fell silent the moment the screen flickered to life, and whatever played next made a room full of powerful people forget how to breathe. Stay with me, because by the time you see what that video revealed, you'll understand why one man's fortune couldn't protect him from a single moment in the rain. Emily Carter sat perfectly still at the plaintiff's table, both hands resting over her stomach as if she could still feel the echo of that night, her eyes fixed forward, unblinking, while across the room Richard Hale adjusted his cufflinks like this was just another business meeting he could control, another negotiation he could win. But there was something different in the air, something heavier than money, heavier than reputation. Something that couldn't be rewritten once it was seen. 3 weeks earlier, the storm had rolled in fast, the kind of Midwest thunderstorm that turns late afternoon into night in less than 10 minutes, wind rattling windows, rain hitting glass like thrown gravel, and inside a sprawling $4 million estate just outside Chicago, Emily stood near the front door, her coat still hanging untouched on the rack. Her voice quiet but steady as she said the one thing Richard didn't expect her to say, the one thing that didn't fit into the version of her he had already decided was weak. I know everything. For a moment, the house felt too small for the truth sitting between them, too fragile for the weight of what had been hidden, and Richard didn't yell, didn't argue, didn't deny it the way men in his position usually do. Instead he exhaled slowly, like someone closing a deal, like someone accepting a cost he had already calculated, and that was when the shift happened, subtle but irreversible. Outside, thunder cracked so sharply it felt like it split the sky open, and Emily instinctively flinched, one hand moving to her stomach, 8 months pregnant, every instinct tuned not to herself anymore but to the life she was protecting, and for a second, just 1 second, she thought he would soften, that something in him would remember who she was, who they had been, but instead he stepped past her, opened the front door. And the wind rushed in, cold and immediate, carrying the smell of rain and something final. You should go, he said, not loudly, not angrily, just clearly. Like a decision already signed and filed, and Emily stared at him, waiting for the rest of the sentence, waiting for the part where he would stop this from becoming real. But it never came, and what happened next didn't look dramatic, didn't look like the kind of moment people imagine when they think of betrayal. It looked quiet, controlled, almost ordinary, and that's what made it unforgettable. The rain was already soaking the stone driveway, turning smooth surfaces slick, the porch light casting long reflections that made depth hard to judge, and as Emily stepped forward, her shoes met the wet ground at the exact moment a gust of wind pushed harder than expected, just enough to throw off balance, just enough to turn a step into something uncertain, and somewhere behind her, the door closed, not slammed, not violently. Just firmly, with a soft, final click that would later echo louder than any thunder in that storm. What no one in that moment realized, what Richard certainly didn't account for, was that somewhere across the street, partially hidden behind a parked SUV, a small red recording light had already been on for over 2 minutes, quietly capturing everything that was about to change both of their lives forever. Rain blurred everything into streaks of silver and shadow, turning distance into uncertainty and sound into something distant and hollow. And for a few disorienting seconds Emily Carter could not tell if the pounding she heard was thunder or her own heartbeat echoing in her ears, each step forward careful, deliberate, as if the ground itself might shift beneath her. Her hand never leaving the curve of her stomach as she whispered softly, more instinct than thought. It is okay, I am right here. Even though she was not sure who she was reassuring anymore. The cold cut through her coat faster than expected, seeping into her skin, making her movements slower, heavier, and the driveway that had once felt familiar now looked unfamiliar under the distorted glow of the porch light, reflections stretching longer than they should, shadows moving in ways that did not match the world she knew, and behind her, the house stood silent, its tall windows glowing warm and distant like a place she no longer belonged to. Somewhere down the street, a car engine idled, barely noticeable beneath the storm, but steady, constant, like it had been there longer than coincidence would allow, and across the road, Lucas Reed adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed not on the storm, not on the house, but on the woman stepping into the night as if she had been pushed out of a life that had already erased her. He had seen situations before that did not feel right, moments where something subtle did not match the story being told, and this was one of them. The timing too precise, the stillness inside the house too controlled, the lack of urgency too calculated. And when Emily's foot slipped slightly on the wet stone, not a fall, not a collapse, just enough of a shift to send a visible wave of tension through her body. That was when instinct overruled observation. Lucas reached for the door handle, then paused, his eyes flicking briefly to the small dash camera mounted just below the rearview mirror, its red light blinking steadily, recording everything without judgment, without interruption, capturing angles no one inside the house would ever consider. And for a fraction of a second, he hesitated, not because he did not know what to do, but because he understood exactly what this moment might become. Back in the driveway, Emily steadied herself, her breath visible in the cold air, each inhale sharp, each exhale controlled, and for the first time since the door had closed behind her, she turned, just slightly, her gaze drifting back toward the house, not with anger, not with desperation, but with something quieter, something final. As if she was memorizing it, not as a home, but as evidence of where her life had changed direction. Inside, Richard Hale stood just beyond the entryway, his silhouette barely visible through the glass, unmoving, watching but not intervening, his reflection layered over hers in the window like two versions of a story that could not exist together, and he did not reach for his phone, did not step outside, did not call her name, because in his mind, this moment had already been decided, already contained, already finished. But outside, the story was still moving, still unfolding, and as Lucas finally opened his door and stepped into the rain, the camera continued recording, silent and precise, capturing not just what was happening, but what was not happening, the absence of action that would soon speak. Louder than anything else, and in that space between intention and consequence, between control and exposure, the truth began to take shape in a way no amount of money could ever rewrite. Lucas Reed did not run, he moved with controlled urgency, the kind that came from years of training where reacting too fast could be just as dangerous as reacting too slow. Rain soaking through his jacket within seconds as he crossed the street, his boots hitting the pavement with steady precision, while his eyes never left Emily Carter, tracking every shift in her posture, every hesitation in her steps. Because what mattered most in moments like this was not what had already happened but what might happen next, and as he got closer he noticed something that made his jaw tighten slightly, not fear, not panic, but recognition, the kind that told him this was not just a woman caught in a storm, this was someone trying very hard to stay composed when her world had just been quietly dismantled. Emily heard him before she saw him, the sound of footsteps cutting through the rain, measured and intentional. And her body reacted instantly, shoulders tensing, breath catching for half a second before she turned, her expression guarded but not hostile, as if she had already decided she could not afford to trust easily, not tonight, not anymore. And when Lucas raised one hand slightly, palm open, keeping his distance, his voice calm and steady despite the storm, it was clear he understood that trust in this moment was not something he could demand, only something he could earn. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked, not too loud, not too soft, just enough to reach her through the rain without overwhelming her, and for a moment she did not answer, her eyes studying him, searching for something she could not quite define, maybe sincerity, maybe safety, maybe just the absence of control that had defined everything behind her, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. "I am fine." The kind of answer people give when they are not fine at all but are not ready to admit it out loud. Lucas nodded slightly, not arguing, not correcting her, because he had heard that tone before, and instead he shifted his stance just enough to angle himself between her and the slickest part of the driveway. Subtle, almost unnoticeable, but deliberate, creating a small barrier without making it obvious, while his eyes flicked once, briefly, back toward the house, noting the still figure behind the glass, the complete lack of movement, the absence of concern that spoke louder than any confrontation could have. "Let me help you get somewhere dry," he said, keeping his voice even, offering assistance without pressure, and Emily hesitated again, her hand tightening slightly over her stomach as another roll of thunder echoed overhead, the sound vibrating through the air in a way that made everything feel more immediate, more fragile, and for the first time since stepping outside, she allowed herself to acknowledge the cold, the instability beneath her feet. The reality that she was alone in a situation she had not chosen. Across the street, the small camera continued recording, its lens catching the angle where Lucas stood just off to her side, where the house remained visible in the background, where the closed door and still silhouette formed a quiet contrast to the movement unfolding in the rain, and inside, Richard Hale finally stepped back from the window, not rushing, not reacting. Simply turning away as if the scene outside no longer required his attention, as if it had already served its purpose. But outside, the moment was not over, it was shifting, evolving, and as Emily took a careful step closer to Lucas, accepting help without fully trusting it, the balance of control began to change in ways no one inside that house could see yet, and no one would be able to undo once the truth found its way into the light. The distance between the driveway and Lucas's car was no more than 30 feet, but in that moment it felt longer, stretched by uncertainty, by the quiet weight of everything Emily Carter had just left behind, and every step she took carried a hesitation that had nothing to do with the rain and everything to do with the realization that nothing about her life was where she thought it was just hours ago, her breathing measured, controlled. Each inhale deliberate, as if she was teaching herself how to move forward 1 second at a time without looking back again. Lucas stayed slightly ahead of her but never too far, adjusting his pace to match hers without making it obvious, the subtle awareness of someone trained to guide without taking control, his eyes scanning the ground, the reflections, the slight changes in elevation that could easily be missed under the shifting light, and when they reached the curb he slowed just enough to allow her to steady herself before stepping up, a small gesture that said more than words ever could in a moment like this. The car door opened with a soft mechanical click, and for a second Emily paused, her hand hovering near the frame, her reflection faintly visible in the window, rain distorting the image into something almost unrecognizable, and she stared at it not out of vanity but out of disbelief, as if she was trying to reconcile the person she had been that morning with the one standing here now, soaked, silent, and suddenly aware that everything familiar had shifted without warning. "It is warm inside," Lucas said quietly, not pushing, not insisting, just offering a fact she could choose to accept, and after a brief pause she nodded once, a small, decisive motion, before lowering herself carefully into the passenger seat, one hand braced against the door, the other still resting protectively where it had been all night, her movements slower now, not from weakness but from awareness, from the understanding that every motion mattered. As the door closed, the sound of the storm softened instantly, replaced by the muted hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of rain against the roof, and for the first time since stepping outside, Emily allowed her shoulders to drop slightly, not fully relaxed, but no longer braced against the world in the same way, her eyes closing for just a second longer than a blink before opening again, focused but distant. Lucas circled around to the driver's side, his movements efficient, controlled, and as he settled behind the wheel, he did not start driving immediately. Instead he glanced once more toward the house, now partially obscured by rain and distance, its lights still glowing but somehow dimmer, less significant than they had been minutes ago, and he noted again what was missing: no movement, no attempt to follow. No sign that anyone inside intended to change what had already been set in motion. The camera on the dashboard continued recording, capturing the angle through the windshield, the blurred outline of the house, the empty driveway, the closed door, and then slowly, as Lucas shifted the car into drive, that image began to recede, growing smaller, less defined, until it disappeared completely behind the curtain of rain. Inside the car, silence settled in, not uncomfortable, not forced, just present, and after a few seconds, Emily spoke, her voice quiet but steadier than before. "He knew I would leave." And Lucas did not respond right away, not because he disagreed, but because he understood that what she was saying was not a question, it was the beginning of something else, something that would not stay contained to that driveway, that storm, or that night, and as the car moved forward, headlights cutting through the rain, the story that had seemed so controlled inside that house was already slipping beyond anyone's ability to contain it. The windshield wipers moved in a steady rhythm, left to right, cutting brief lines of clarity through the rain before the world blurred again, and for several miles neither of them spoke, the kind of silence that was not empty but full of things waiting to be understood, processed, and eventually said out loud, and Emily Carter kept her gaze forward, watching the road stretch ahead in long, dim reflections of streetlights. Her mind replaying moments not as memories but as questions, each one sharper than the last, each one pointing to something she had not seen before. "He knew I would leave," she repeated, softer this time, almost to herself, and Lucas Reed nodded slightly, his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes on the road but his attention fully present, because statements like that were never just about what had happened, they were about what it meant, about the pattern behind the moment, about intention rather than reaction. "People who plan ahead usually expect a certain outcome," he said carefully, not pushing too far, not assuming more than she was ready to accept, and Emily let out a slow breath, the kind that carried both realization and resistance at the same time, because accepting that something had been planned meant accepting that it had not been random, not emotional, not impulsive, but deliberate. The city lights grew brighter as they moved farther from the quiet stretch of residential streets, traffic picking up slightly despite the weather, headlights reflecting off wet pavement in long streaks of white and gold, and inside the car, the warmth began to settle in, easing the tension in Emily's shoulders just enough for her to notice how tightly she had been holding herself together. "He had been distant for weeks," she said, her voice gaining clarity as the pieces began to connect. "Meetings that ran late, calls he would take in another room, things that did not add up, but I told myself it was work, that it always came back to work." And she paused, her hand pressing slightly more firmly against her stomach as if grounding herself in something real, something unchanged. Lucas listened without interrupting, because this was not the moment for answers, it was the moment for her to hear herself, to recognize the pattern in her own words, and after a few seconds she continued. "Tonight he did not argue, he did not try to explain anything, he just opened the door. And the simplicity of that action seemed to carry more weight than anything else, because it was not what he said, it was what he did not say, not fight, not negotiate, not hesitate." Lucas glanced briefly at the dashboard camera, the small red light still blinking steadily, and then back to the road, his voice even when he spoke again. "That kind of response usually means the decision was already made before the conversation started." And Emily closed her eyes for a moment, not in defeat, but in recognition, because that was the part she could not ignore anymore, the timing, the calm, the absence of surprise. The car slowed as they approached an intersection, the red light reflecting across the hood in a steady glow, and for a brief moment everything felt still again, suspended between what had already happened and what would come next, and when the light changed and the car moved forward, Emily opened her eyes and looked straight ahead, her expression no longer uncertain but focused in a way that had not been there before. "Then he expected me not to come back," she said, and this time it was not a question, it was a conclusion, and somewhere in that realization, something shifted, not outwardly, not dramatically, but in a way that would shape everything that followed, because the moment she understood that this had been planned, she also understood that it could be proven, and once something could be proven, it could no longer be controlled by the person who created it. The rain began to ease as they moved deeper into the city, not stopping completely but softening into a steady drizzle that turned sharp noise into a quiet hum, and with that shift, the world outside the car felt less chaotic, more controlled, almost as if the storm had served its purpose and was now stepping aside for whatever came next, and inside the car, that same transition was happening in a different way. Not in the environment, but in Emily Carter's thoughts, where confusion was slowly being replaced by something more structured, more deliberate, something that no longer asked what just happened but started asking why. Lucas Reed noticed the change without needing it to be spoken, the way her posture straightened slightly, the way her gaze stopped drifting and began focusing, and he had seen it before, that moment when someone moved from reacting to thinking, from surviving a situation to analyzing it, and it was always the point where things became more serious, because once a person started connecting events, the situation was no longer contained to a single moment, it became a sequence, a pattern. Something that could be traced. "There is something else," Emily said after a few seconds, her voice calm but more certain now, and Lucas nodded once, signaling he was listening without interrupting the flow she had just found, and she continued. He asked me earlier today if I was planning to go out tonight, which was unusual. He never asked that, and when I said no, he just nodded, like he was confirming something. And she paused, her eyes narrowing slightly as she replayed the detail. At the time it felt like nothing, but now it feels like he needed to know exactly where I would be. Lucas exhaled slowly, not in surprise, but in recognition, because details like that were rarely accidental. They were checkpoints, small confirmations in a larger plan, and he kept his voice measured when he responded. That sounds like he was making sure the timing lined up. And Emily nodded faintly, the pieces continuing to align in a way that made the situation clearer but also heavier. Because clarity did not make it easier, it just made it undeniable. The car turned onto a quieter street, lined with low buildings and dim streetlights, the kind of place that felt removed from the world she had just left, and Lucas slowed the vehicle as he spoke again, this time more directly. Emily, I need to ask you something, and you can tell me if you are not comfortable answering. And she looked at him, not guarded this time, but attentive, ready, and he continued. Did he know you were pregnant before tonight became different? Carefully choosing words that did not push too hard but still addressed what mattered. Emily's expression shifted, not with surprise, but with a kind of quiet confirmation. He has known for months, she said, her voice steady. And at first he seemed happy, or at least he said he was, but then everything changed slowly, not all at once, just enough that I kept telling myself it was temporary. And she looked down briefly, her hand resting where it had been all night. I thought we were adjusting, not falling apart. Lucas tightened his grip slightly on the wheel, not out of tension, but out of focus, because that detail reframed everything, not just a relationship ending, but a timeline that overlapped with something much bigger, something that could not be dismissed as coincidence. The car came to a stop in front of a well-lit building, a place that felt safe, neutral, and as the engine idled, Lucas turned slightly toward her, his voice calm but firm in a way that carried weight without pressure. What happened tonight is not just about you being asked to leave a house, he said. It is about how and when it happened, and those details matter more than anything else. And Emily held his gaze for a moment before nodding once, because she understood now, not fully, not completely, but enough to know that the story did not end in that storm. It had only just begun to reveal itself. Emily Carter stepped out of the car slowly, the air now damp instead of harsh, the rain reduced to a fine mist that clung to the pavement, and softened the edges of everything around her, and for a moment she simply stood there, taking in the unfamiliar building in front of her, a modest medical center with bright interior lights that felt almost too calm compared to the storm she had just left behind. And the contrast made everything feel more real, not less, because it removed the chaos and left only the truth of what had happened. Lucas Reed moved around to her side, opening the door without a word, giving her space but remaining close enough that she did not have to wonder if she was alone, and as she stepped forward, her movements were more careful now, not hesitant, but intentional, as if every step carried awareness that had not been there before, and when the glass doors slid open, a wave of warm air met her, steady and controlled. The kind of environment where things were observed, measured, and documented. Inside, the reception area was quiet, only a few people seated, their conversations low, their attention focused on their own concerns, and for the first time since the storm began, Emily realized that what she had experienced was not visible to anyone else, not obvious, not something that would draw attention unless she chose to make it known, and that realization carried both relief and weight, because it meant the truth depended on what she did next. Lucas spoke briefly with the receptionist, his voice calm and professional, providing just enough information to ensure Emily would be seen without creating unnecessary attention, and as he stepped back, he nodded toward a chair, offering her a place to sit without directing her, allowing her to decide, and she lowered herself slowly, one hand gripping the armrest, the other still resting protectively where it had been all night. Her breathing steady but deeper now, as if her body was finally catching up to everything her mind had begun to process. A nurse approached within minutes, her tone gentle but efficient, guiding Emily through a few simple questions, nothing invasive, nothing overwhelming, just enough to begin assessing what needed attention, and as Emily answered, her voice remained composed, but there was a new layer beneath it, something firmer, something that had not been there earlier, because she was no longer describing an event, she was describing evidence. Lucas remained nearby, not intruding, not interrupting, but present in a way that grounded the moment, and when the nurse stepped away briefly to prepare the next step, he glanced once more at Emily, his expression steady, and said quietly, "Everything you say here matters, even the small details." And she looked at him, not with uncertainty this time, but with understanding, because she had already begun to see the situation differently, not as something that happened to her, but as something that could be examined, explained, and eventually proven. Across town, in a house now silent and still, Richard Hale poured himself a drink, the storm outside no longer visible from where he stood, his world returning to order, to routine, to the controlled environment he was used to, and in his mind, the night had already ended, the outcome already secured, because from his perspective, there had been no witnesses, no interruption. No reason to believe that what happened would extend beyond the walls of that house. But what he could not see, what he had not accounted for, was that the moment Emily walked through those doors, the narrative had shifted from private to documented, from controlled to observed, and as the nurse returned and guided Emily toward the examination room, the quiet hum of that building carried something far more powerful than the storm had. It carried the beginning of a record that could not be erased. And for the first time that night, the balance of the story had moved away from him entirely. The examination room was quiet in a way that made every small sound feel amplified, the soft rustle of paper on the bed, the distant hum of medical equipment behind the walls, the faint rhythm of footsteps passing in the hallway. And as Emily Carter sat there with her back straight, and her hands folded carefully over her stomach, she became aware of something she had not allowed herself to feel until now, not fear, not panic, but responsibility, the kind that shifts everything from personal to undeniable, because what happened was no longer just about her, it was about what needed to be protected moving forward. The nurse returned with a calm, practiced smile, guiding Emily through each step with clear, measured instructions, checking her vitals, asking questions that were simple on the surface but precise in purpose, and Emily answered each one with a clarity that surprised even herself, her voice steady, her words deliberate, because she understood now that accuracy mattered more than emotion, that details mattered more than assumptions, and that every answer was becoming part of something larger than the moment itself. "Did you experience any instability when you were outside?" the nurse asked gently, choosing her wording carefully, and Emily paused for half a second, not because she did not know the answer, but because she was selecting how to describe it, not exaggerating, not minimizing, just stating what was real. "The ground was wet, and I had to steady myself," she said, her tone even, and the nurse nodded, making a note without reaction, without judgment, just documentation. Across the room, a monitor was set up, its screen still blank for a moment before flickering to life, and when the technician entered, the atmosphere shifted slightly, not tense, but more focused, more precise, as if the room itself understood that what came next carried weight, and Emily lay back slowly, following instructions, her eyes fixed on the ceiling for a second before drifting toward the screen as the procedure began. The first faint movement appeared almost immediately, subtle but unmistakable, and the technician's expression remained neutral but attentive, adjusting the angle slightly, confirming what needed to be seen, and Emily watched, her breathing slowing as she focused on that small, steady sign of life, that quiet confirmation that despite everything, something remained stable, something remained unchanged. "Everything looks consistent," the technician said after a moment, her voice calm and reassuring without being overly emotional, and Emily closed her eyes briefly, not in relief alone, but in acknowledgement, because that single statement carried more meaning than anything else she had heard that night. Outside the room, Lucas Reed stood near the doorway, his posture relaxed but alert, giving space while remaining present, and his attention shifted briefly to his phone as a notification appeared, a silent reminder of the recording still saved, still intact, still holding the version of events that no one inside that house could alter, and he locked the screen again without opening it, because he already knew what it contained. And more importantly, he knew when it would matter. Inside, as the examination concluded and Emily slowly sat up again, the nurse handed her a small folder, standard procedure, routine information, but within that folder was something far from routine, the first official record of a night that had begun in silence and control and was now being translated into facts, into notes, into something permanent. Emily took the folder with both hands, her grip firm but calm, and for the first time since stepping out into the storm, her expression carried something new, not just understanding, but direction, because she no longer saw herself as someone who had been removed from a situation, she saw herself as someone who had stepped into a process, one that would continue, one that would build, and one that, piece by piece, would bring everything that had been hidden into a place where it could no longer remain unseen. When Emily Carter stepped back into a hallway, the world felt quieter than before, not because the building had changed, but because something inside her had, the noise of uncertainty replaced by a steady awareness that every step now mattered, every word carried weight, and as she held the folder close against her, she was no longer just reacting to what had happened, she was preparing for what would come next. Lucas Reed looked up as she approached, reading the shift in her expression before she said anything, and there was a brief moment of understanding between them, not spoken, but clear, the kind that happens when two people recognize that a situation has crossed the line from temporary to consequential. "Everything is stable," Emily said, her voice calm, measured, and Lucas nodded once, not in relief, but in acknowledgement, because stability did not mean resolution, it meant the situation had room to unfold, and that was where things became more complex. They walked toward the exit together, the soft sound of their footsteps echoing lightly against the polished floor, and as the automatic doors opened again, the night air greeted them differently this time, cooler, quieter, the storm now reduced to a distant memory rather than an immediate threat, and the parking lot lights cast steady pools of brightness across the pavement, eliminating the shadows that had once made everything uncertain. "What happens next?" Emily asked, not as a question of confusion, but as a step in a process she had already decided to follow, and Lucas paused for a moment before answering, choosing his words carefully. "That depends on what you want to do with what you know." And she considered that, her gaze steady, her posture grounded, because for the first time that night, the direction was not being dictated by someone else. "I want the truth to be clear," she said simply, and Lucas gave a slight nod, as if that answer confirmed something he had already expected, because clarity was not just about understanding, it was about accountability, and accountability required more than memory, it required evidence. He reached into the car and retrieved a small device, holding it up briefly before handing it to her, the same camera that had been recording from across the street, its surface still cool from the night air, and Emily looked at it for a moment before taking it, her fingers wrapping around it carefully, as if she understood immediately what it represented without needing an explanation. "This recorded everything from the moment you stepped outside," Lucas said, his tone steady, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just factual, and Emily felt a subtle shift in her chest, not shock, not surprise, but recognition, because this was the piece that connected what she knew with what could be shown. She looked down at the device again, then back up at Lucas, her expression focused. "Then it does not end with his version of the story," she said, and Lucas shook his head slightly. "No, it does not." And for a brief moment neither of them spoke, because that realization did not need to be expanded, it was already complete. Across town, Richard Hale sat in a quiet room, the storm long gone, the night returning to normal, and in his mind, the situation remained contained, controlled, a closed chapter that would not follow him beyond the walls of his home, because from his perspective, there had been no interruption, no interference, no reason to believe that what happened would extend beyond that moment. But as Emily stood in the parking lot, holding the one thing he had not accounted for, the narrative was no longer his to manage, and as she opened the car door and stepped inside once more, the reflection in the window no longer looked uncertain, it looked resolved, because the story had moved beyond what was said and into what could be proven, and once something could be proven, it could not be undone. The car moved again, but this time the silence inside it felt different, not heavy with uncertainty but sharpened by intention, and Emily Carter held the small recording device in her hands, turning it slightly as if feeling its weight, not physically, but symbolically, because she understood now that this was not just an object, it was a turning point, the exact moment where something private had become undeniable. The city passed by in steady motion outside the window, storefront lights reflecting in long streaks across the glass, and Lucas Reed drove with the same controlled focus as before, but there was a shift in his awareness as well, because now the situation had moved beyond observation, it had entered a phase where decisions would define everything that followed. "There is a process for this," Lucas said after a few minutes, his voice calm, measured, "and it starts with making sure what you have is preserved correctly." And Emily nodded slightly, her eyes still on the device, because she already understood that this was not something to rush, not something to act on emotionally, but something to handle with precision. "I do not want this to become something that gets lost or questioned," she said, her tone steady, and Lucas gave a small nod in agreement. "Then we make sure it does not," he replied, and there was a quiet confidence in that statement, not reassurance for comfort, but clarity about what needed to be done. They pulled into a quieter part of the city, where office buildings stood with only a few lights still on, and Lucas parked near the entrance of a modest but well-maintained building, the kind that did not draw attention but held importance for those who knew what it represented. "There is someone you should speak with," he said, turning off the engine but not rushing to exit, giving her space to process, and Emily looked at him, her expression focused. "A lawyer," she said, not as a guess, but as a conclusion, and Lucas gave a slight nod. "Someone who understands how to handle situations like this from the beginning, not after things have already been complicated." Emily exhaled slowly, her grip on the device firm but controlled, and for a moment she looked out the window, at the building, at the stillness of the night, and then back at her reflection in the glass, no longer uncertain, no longer questioning, but resolved in a way that came from understanding not just what had happened, but what it meant. "He thought it would end tonight," she said quietly, and Lucas responded without hesitation. "That is usually the assumption when there are no witnesses." And Emily's gaze shifted slightly, a subtle but unmistakable change, because she now knew that assumption had already been broken. They stepped out of the car, the air cool but calm, the storm now completely gone, and as they approached the entrance, the building lights reflected clearly on the pavement, no distortion, no shifting shadows, everything visible in a way that mirrored the path ahead. Inside, the lobby was quiet, the receptionist looking up briefly before returning to her work, and Lucas led the way with quiet familiarity, as if this was not his first time here, as if this step had been part of a larger understanding long before tonight. Emily followed, her steps steady, her posture composed, and as they reached the office door and Lucas paused before opening it, she took one last look at the device in her hands, not with hesitation, but with certainty, because this was no longer about what she had lost, it was about what she now held. Across the city, in a house that felt untouched by consequence, Richard Hale checked his phone, scrolling through messages that had nothing to do with what had just happened, his world continuing forward without interruption, because from where he stood, the night had already been resolved, already contained, already forgotten. But as Emily stepped into that office, carrying the one thing that could not be dismissed, the reality began to shift beyond his reach, because the moment evidence meets intention, control no longer belongs to the one who planned the event, it belongs to the one who can prove it. The office door closed softly behind Emily Carter, and the quiet that followed felt different from every silence that had come before, not uncertain, not reactive, but deliberate, the kind of stillness that exists in places where decisions are made carefully and consequences are understood fully before a single word is spoken, and as she stepped further inside, the environment itself seemed to reinforce that shift, clean lines, organized surfaces, everything in its place, a space built not for emotion, but for clarity. Daniel Brooks stood as they entered, his presence calm but attentive, the kind of composure that came from years of seeing situations unfold in ways most people never expected, and he did not rush forward, did not overwhelm the moment with introductions or assumptions. Instead, he simply gestured toward a chair, offering Emily a place to sit before anything else began. Because he understood that control in a situation like this started with giving it back to the person who had lost it. Emily sat down slowly, the folder from the medical center resting in her lap, the recording device still in her hand, and for a brief second, she looked at both, the documented present and the captured past, before placing them carefully on the desk in front of her, aligning them side by side as if she already knew they belonged together. Daniel took a seat across from her, his expression neutral but focused, and when he spoke, his voice was steady, measured. "Tell me what happened, but take your time." And there was something in the way he said it that removed any sense of urgency, because in this room, speed did not matter, accuracy did. Emily began with the simplest version, not dramatized, not embellished, just the sequence of events as they occurred, her words clear, her tone controlled, and as she spoke, Daniel listened without interruption, his attention fixed not just on what she said, but on how the details connected, how the timing aligned, how the absence of certain actions was just as important as the actions themselves. When she finished, there was a brief pause, not awkward, not uncertain, but analytical, and Daniel leaned forward slightly, his gaze shifting to the device on the desk. "And this?" he said, not as a question, but as a confirmation, and Emily nodded once. "It recorded everything from the moment I stepped outside." And Lucas Reed, standing just to the side, added quietly, "Continuous recording, no interruptions," providing a detail that did not need emphasis but carried significance nonetheless. Daniel reached for the device, handling it carefully, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for what it represented, and he placed it back down after a moment, his expression unchanged but his focus sharper, because he understood immediately what this meant, not just as evidence, but as a shift in control. "This is not just about what happened," he said, his voice even. "This is about what can be demonstrated clearly, without interpretation." And Emily listened, her posture steady, because she had already reached that understanding on her own, she just needed to hear it confirmed. Outside, the city continued as it always did, unaware of the quiet decisions being made inside that room, unaware that something had already begun to move forward in a way that could not be reversed, and across town. Richard Hale remained in a world where nothing had changed, where the night had ended as expected, where the absence of resistance had been mistaken for resolution. But inside that office, the narrative had already shifted into something structured, something documented, something that would not rely on memory or assumption, and as Daniel opened a notepad and began outlining the next steps, his pen moving with precise intent, Emily no longer looked like someone who had been removed from her life, she looked like someone who had stepped into a process that would define what came next. Because once a story is placed into the hands of someone who knows how to present it, it no longer belongs to the one who tried to control it, it belongs to the truth itself. Daniel Brooks did not rush, and that was the first thing that made the situation feel real in a different way, because urgency belonged to emotion, but precision belonged to outcome, and as he reviewed the notes he had just written, his pen pausing at specific points, it became clear that what mattered was not how quickly this moved forward, but how firmly it was built from the start. Emily Carter watched him in silence, her hands now resting lightly on the edge of the desk, no longer gripping anything tightly, no longer holding on to uncertainty, because the structure forming in front of her gave shape to what had felt overwhelming just hours before, and when Daniel finally looked up, his expression remained composed, but there was a clarity in his eyes that had not been there at the beginning. "There are two parts to this," he said, his voice steady, each word deliberate. "What happened, and what can be proven beyond dispute." And he tapped the folder lightly before shifting his hand toward the recording device. "And in your case, those two things are aligning." Emily nodded once, not because she needed confirmation, but because she understood the distinction, and Lucas Reed remained silent nearby, his presence steady but unobtrusive, as if he had already stepped back into the role of observer now that the situation had moved into a different phase. Daniel leaned back slightly, his gaze focused. "The timing, the conditions, the fact that you were placed outside in a situation that required stability while you were in a vulnerable state, those are not details that can be dismissed," he continued, and Emily listened carefully, because this was no longer interpretation, it was translation, her experience being converted into something structured, something that would carry weight in a place where facts mattered more than narratives. And the recording, Daniel added, his hand resting briefly on the device again, provides context that cannot be rewritten. And there was a subtle shift in the room as those words settled, not dramatic, not emotional, but definitive, because context was the one thing that could not be argued once it was clearly established. Emily exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing just slightly, not from relief, but from understanding, because she could see now how the pieces connected, how the moment in the storm was no longer isolated, it was part of a sequence that could be followed from beginning to end without interruption. What does that mean for him? She asked, her voice calm, not seeking revenge, not driven by anger, but focused on consequence, and Daniel's response was measured, precise. It means he does not control how this is presented anymore, he said, and then, after a brief pause, he added, and once something is presented clearly, it tends to carry its own weight. Outside, the city remained unchanged, traffic moving, lights shifting, people continuing their routines without awareness of what had just begun to unfold behind closed doors, and across town, Richard Hale sat in a space that still felt familiar, still felt controlled, his evening moving forward without interruption, because from his perspective, nothing had challenged the version of events he had already accepted as final. But inside that office, the direction had already been set, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that came from structure, from evidence, from the understanding that once a narrative is supported by facts that cannot be altered, it no longer depends on who speaks first or who speaks louder, it depends only on what can be shown. Daniel closed his notebook with a soft, final motion, not as an ending, but as a transition, and as he looked at Emily, there was no urgency in his expression, no pressure, just clarity, because everything that needed to begin had already begun, and from that point forward, the outcome would not be shaped by assumption, but by the simple, undeniable presence of truth placed exactly where it needed to be. The next morning did not arrive with noise or chaos or sudden confrontation, it came quietly, with soft light filtering through tall courthouse windows and the low murmur of voices that carried the weight of decisions about to be made. And Emily Carter walked through those doors with a calm that did not come from forgetting the night before, but from understanding it completely, every step measured, every breath steady. Her hand resting lightly against her stomach, not out of fear anymore, but out of presence, as if she was no longer protecting something fragile, but carrying something certain. Across the room, Richard Hale stood with the same composed posture he had worn his entire life, tailored suit, controlled expression, the image of someone accustomed to outcomes bending in his favor, and for a brief moment, their eyes met, not with anger, not with accusation, but with recognition, because what stood between them now was not emotion, it was evidence, and evidence does not react, it does not argue. It simply exists. Daniel Brooks spoke first when the time came, his voice steady, clear, presenting the sequence not as a story, but as a structure, each detail placed exactly where it belonged, the timing, the conditions, the absence of response, and then, without pause, the recording was introduced, not dramatically, not for effect, but as a natural extension of what had already been established, and when the screen came to life, the room shifted in a way that no raised voice ever could, because what it showed was not exaggerated, not distorted, just precise, a moment captured without interruption, without interpretation, a version of events that could not be reshaped once it was seen. No one spoke while it played, not because they were instructed to remain silent, but because silence was the only response that fit, and when it ended, the quiet that followed carried more weight than any argument that could have been made, and Richard did not step forward, did not interrupt, did not attempt to redirect the moment, because for the first time, the outcome was no longer something he could influence. Emily did not look at him again, not out of avoidance, but because she no longer needed to, her attention fixed ahead, her posture unchanged, because the moment that had defined everything was no longer behind her, it had been placed in front of everyone, exactly as it happened, and that was enough. Outside, the day continued as it always does, cars moving, people passing, unaware of how quietly a life can change direction when truth is placed where it cannot be ignored. And when Emily stepped out of the courthouse later, the air felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just clear, and she paused for a brief second at the top of the steps, her gaze forward, her expression calm, and in that stillness, there was no need for words. No need for explanation, because everything that needed to be understood had already been seen. Somewhere behind her, inside a room where control had finally met its limit, Richard Hale stood in a silence he could not negotiate, a reality he could not adjust, and the distance between them was no longer measured in steps or space, but in something far more permanent, the difference between a moment that was planned and a truth that could not be undone. And as Emily walked forward, not quickly, not slowly, but with quiet certainty, the story did not end with what was taken from her, it ended with what remained, because some men spend their lives building power they believe will protect them, only to discover that it takes a single undeniable truth to show them what they never owned at all.